Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the second in this lecture series, America's Conflicts. Before I get going on it, would you please turn off your cell phones? Don't hear any beeps or clicks or voices. Means you all turned them off before we got here. That's great. Second of all, I'd like to thank all of our sponsors, those people sitting in the front row who donated to make this whole series possible, and to the Gasparilla Inn for supporting us in many, many ways. This is going to be a lecture about the Civil War. Now, you didn't think you'd get a year with me as head of Friends without the Civil War coming up, did you? I mean, come on. Over the summer, I must have gotten 5 or 6 emails about this great book that had just been written. And so I read the book, I read all the emails, and then I went to my favorite source of finding great lectures for programs, which is the Organization of American Historians, who's been a partner with us for 5 years in helping us get speakers. It's an organization dedicated to having history spread throughout the country, and it's a really great group of people that we work with. Don Doyle was on the list, and so he got invited to come here, and he said yes. I'll tell you just very little bit about him before we get going. First of all, he speaks 4 languages, so you can quiz him at the question and answer period. You have to pick Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, or English. Since 2004, he's been a history professor at the University of South Carolina. And the book he wrote is called The Cause of All Nations, which was kind of a unique global perspective of the Civil War that they never taught us in high school or college, unless you went to the University of South Carolina. Don, welcome.
I don't need that. Roger, thank you very much for that generous and amusing introduction. I don't know if I speak 4 languages, but I can get through most of them and did for a lot of this research. I'm delighted to be here and delighted that, that you are benefiting the Organization of American Historians, one of my favorite groups. It is the professional organization for all historians of America, wherever they live. We have a lot of international members. And of course, I came here as a philanthropic mission to serve the organization and to enjoy this great Florida weather. I came in, you know, it was terrible up there in Columbia, South Carolina, drizzling rain and cold and so on. And I just thought the worse it is, the more I'll enjoy this. And when I got out of the airport, we went through, and all of a sudden my phone was going off and the driver's phone was going off with tornado warnings coming in. But I'm glad to be here and very pleased to see such a large and enthusiastic crowd in this splendid lecture series. I've just been learning about it and I'm very pleased to be here. And delighted to know that you're, at least some of you, are fascinated with the Civil War, and as Roger promised, this will be a different view of our Civil War, our American Civil War. David Potter, back in the 1960s, during the centenary of the Civil War, complained that this has been the source of some of our worst navel gazing, that historians have treated this war as though it occurred with nothing else in the world, that it was an American war fought by American soldiers on American soil about issues that were uniquely American and with impact that was limited to the borders of America for the most part. For many years, and it was part of the effort to reconcile North and South, the war was taught as a gigantic mistake. Historians focused on the zealous fanaticism on both sides, abolitionists in the North, fire eaters in the South, a brothers' war that a generation of blundering politicians could not compromise and could not end. Slavery wasn't really the issue. They argued it was reaching its natural limits. And there was nothing that divided these people, these Americans, that could not have been resolved had we better politicians. Americans like to blame their politicians rather than themselves, and this was no exception. And so that kind of revisionism gave way at the very time that Potter was speaking to an interpretation in the 1960s during the centenary that began to refocus on slavery, not just as the cause of the Civil War, but as a kind of unreconciled um, uh, problem of America, the legacy of slavery and the ongoing uh, reluctant reconciliation between white and black. And so the Civil War now became unfinished revolution, in Eric Foner's felicitous phrase. And from that point on, we've talked largely about slavery and race, and some of the arguments, they go back 150 years. I've gotten so that instead of arguing, you just go to it wasn't about slavery; it was about the tariff, and you can almost just say, okay, 4A, on the flow chart. It's kind of beyond debate. It's predictable, a little bit monotonous at times, and very well rehearsed. I wanted to instead to step outside this national debate, this conversation that Americans have been having with themselves about not just the war and what began the war, but also about the ongoing racial issues that and sectional issues that divide Americans. I wanted to look at the American war from outside the nation, and often through the eyes of foreigners. What did they make of it? And the main conclusion that I make in my book is that this war really mattered to the rest of the world. And when I say that, I mean it in two senses. One is that they really paid attention to it. The newspapers were filled with reports on the battles, discussions of Lincoln's speeches or what Jefferson Davis was doing. Reports from the South and North filled the newspapers. They debated it where they could. Many of them sent soldiers over during the war from different parts of Europe. But it mattered in another sense in that this war really did have an impact on the rest of the world, on the future of democracy, as well as free labor and slavery. So it was a war that also had a terrific impact on the global economy, especially the cotton industry, the cotton production. But why did it matter so much to them? I hinted that there were tremendous economic strains. About 80% of the world's cotton came from the South in 1860. All of the industrial nations, not just Britain, but much of Northern Europe, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, even Italy depended heavily on Southern cotton. There was just a small amount of cotton coming from other parts of the world in India and in Egypt, Northern Africa, and Brazil, but most of it was coming from the American South. And what they were concerned with was not just unemployment of the cotton mill workers in Europe, but the social unrest that this would lead to, and revolutionary upheavals possibly. So there was tremendous political pressure and fear within European industrial countries about this war that kept dragging on 1 year after another. But more than that, it seemed that what the foreigners fixed upon were the ideological issues at stake in the war. And they saw it as a battle between forces of republicanism, government by the people, without kings, without priests, and monarchy and aristocracy, and spoke a great deal about what they called the Republican experiment. And the word experiment is rich with meaning. It means a kind of unproven, tenuous, tentative trial for a system of government that, in the view of many, had failed again and again. That republicanism, government by the people, under strain, would collapse into anarchy or despotism. It was fragile. It was unproven. We now, many in the Pentagon and some neoconservatives argue about democratic peace theory. Have you heard about this? That democracies don't make wars with one another. It's always democracy defending itself against tyrannical, anti-democratic societies. I'm not debating that, but This was a theory that democracies can't fight wars, that they cannot summon and require their citizens to fight wars, and that the politics of a democracy simply would make it, render it unable to sustain a long war. So this was a test of those principles. The conservatives, and by that I mean people who favored monarchical, aristocratic rule, they had a field day when the so-called Great Republic, as its admirers called it, was now at war with itself. Tory MP Sir John Ramsden in May 1861 warned that Britain was now witnessing the bursting of that great Republican bubble so often held up to us as the model on which to recast our own English Constitution. These were the radicals and others who wanted to expand the suffrage and to allow all the middle class and working class, at least males, and some even talked about women voting in Britain, John Bright and Richard Cobden and others. The first duty of the British government, Ramsden answered, should be to strengthen, quote, the great distinction between the safe and irrational and tempered liberties of England and the wild and unreflecting excesses of mob rule, which had too often desecrated freedom and outraged humanity in America. The Earl of Shrewsbury, another venerable Tory leader, spoke to his constituents in Worcester, England, and congratulated Britain on its aristocratic government, its constitutional monarchy, and drew disparaging comparisons between it and the mess that you saw across the Atlantic, not just in the United States, but in Latin America too. Here it was, extreme democracy, one of their favorite expressions. Extreme democracy meaning where everyone voted, universal suffrage. All men at least voted. Extreme democracy running amok in America. In America, Shrewsbury told his audience, they saw democracy on its trial, and they had seen how it had failed. Those standing before me today, the Earl of Shrewsbury said, will see monarchy and aristocracy return to all of the American republics. They would find their way back to monarchy, or they would invite European intervention and protection, a kind of recolonization, if you will, of the Americas. But listen to Madrid's very conservative Catholic newspaper, El Pensamiento Español. In the model republic of what were the United States, we see more and more clearly of how little account is a society constituted without God, merely for the sake of men. Look at their wild ways of annihilating each other, confiscating each other's goods, mutually destroying each other's cities, and cordially wishing each other extinct. This was a mockery of the so-called model republic that was founded in rebellion and atheism and populated by the dregs of all nations in the world, and living without law of God or man. Now America's republic stood doomed to, quote, die in a flood of blood and mire and serve as a rebuke to the flaming theories of democracy. So they were pounding the stake. At first, a lot of Union defenders in Europe and elsewhere said, no, that's not it. This is just a particular war in America, and it doesn't prove anything about the Republican experiment. And then others began to see, pro-Union, that this was a good way to frame the war, that this was a trial of government by the people, and they rallied people to stand by it. Now, the European powers did not wait for the Republican experiment to fail and to collapse. They hastened to take advantage of the American debacle. The Monroe Doctrine, which had warned against all future settlement, all future colonization in the American hemisphere, was now toothless. America was preoccupied with this war, distracted, as they said. And the European great powers like vultures came in, swarming to take advantage of this maimed republic, the United States. In March 1861, before Fort Sumter's guns had even been fired, Spain invaded the Dominican Republic, its former colony, and re-annexed it to the Spanish Empire. This is where William Seward, remember, said, let's start a foreign war. We'll declare war against Spain and we'll reunite the South and North in a foreign war. He predicted that once the Southerners saw foreign ships entering New York Harbor, that the hills of South Carolina would empty as soldiers came to defend America against a foreign. This was his foreign war panacea. Lincoln said, no, I don't think so. We'll take it. But Seward had a point, and he realized that, whether or not it would have reunited America, maybe not, but this was Europe taking advantage of America's weakness. There was no answer from the Americans, from Lincoln. They asked for explanations from the Spanish ambassador in Washington. He, meanwhile, writing to Madrid and saying, this is our hour of glory. This is when America is going to die. The American Republic is in its the agony of its death throes. All we have to do is wait. Seeing no answer from the United States, Spain, together with France and Britain, held a convention in London in October 1861 and organized the Tripartite Alliance. And in December, wasting no time, they launched an Allied invasion of Mexico. The reason for this was to recover foreign debts and to insist on reparations for British and French citizens who had been harmed and unprotected in Mexico. But everyone understood that this was not just to get debts. Benito Juarez, the elected Republican president of the Republic of Mexico, who came to power exactly or almost at the same time as Abraham Lincoln did, was a Republican. He had a liberal constitution, and the Church Party, the conservatives, wanted to overthrow him. And the European powers were coming in to help with this. Juarez, his treasury exhausted, had suspended the debt, the payment of interest on the foreign debt for 2 years, and this was the excuse now for the Allied invasion of Mexico. France had a plan for regime change. They wanted to overthrow Benito Juarez and to go further to install a European prince. His candidate was Maximilian, the Habsburg prince from Vienna. And this would make Mexico, first of all, a model monarchy, kind of like the model republic. This would be a model monarchy. It would show the value to all of the Spanish-American republics of a good order under a strong monarch, someone who was from the Habsburg dynasty, the kind of gold standard for aristocracy in Europe, and would bring political peace to Mexico. Mexico, in turn, was the key to control of Central America. And through Central America, France, Napoleon III in particular, wanted to build a canal. He envisioned what would later become the canal through Panama across Nicaragua. And it would establish France as the imperial leader of a two-ocean empire. They had just come to Indochina, later known as Vietnam, and the race was on for the establishment of Europeans in the Pacific as well as the Atlantic world. The French also had an idea for the regeneration of what Napoleon III and his intellectual aides called the Latin race. The idea that the French were the leaders of a Latin race that included Spain, Italy, France, of course, and Portugal, all of those Roman language-speaking nations who were in competition in the Old World with the Teutonic Anglo-Saxon forces in the in the Eastern Hemisphere in Europe, and also now we're at a disadvantage in competition with the Anglo-Saxon democracy of the North. And so he, under French tutelage and with Maximilian helping, they were going to restore the Latin race to its proper place in both hemispheres and to help France reassert the glory that was once Napoleon I in an earlier history of France. Napoleon III was his nephew, you may remember. This was Napoleon III's grand design for Mexico and for all of Latin America. The idea would be that other Spanish-American republics, troubled as they were by dictatorships and constant revolutions and civil wars, would come under the protection of the French and Mexico. He even had a plan where his younger brother, the younger brother of Maximilian, would marry the daughter of Dom Pedro of Brazil, the Empire of Brazil. And so you would have a Portuguese-Spanish alliance here in both worlds. And in December of 1861, to continue the story, Britain almost started war with the United States when two Confederate envoys were captured on board Her Majesty's ship, the Trent, a mail ship carrier that was carrying these two diplomats. It was a dishonor to the British flag. The drums were beating in London to go to war with America and teach them a lesson for coming on board their ship and taking these Confederate envoys, not in defense of the Confederacy, the British insisted, but in defense of their neutral rights, their rights as a neutral force. Now, this idea of the war as a clash between ideologies and systems of government, not systems of labor, that was there, but not as important for many Europeans and Americans at this point. It originates with this idea, this conservative idea that democracy has failed, but it's embraced, as I said, by defenders of the Union to make this into an epic battle for democracy, for government by the people. Karl Marx, writing for the New York Daily Tribune, he paid his rent by writing for American readers. The New York Daily Tribune was one of the largest papers in America, about European opinion of what was going on in Europe at the beginning of the war. He'd been doing this since the early 1850s, and he's a brilliant and incisive student of international politics. So it's a very valuable view. Of course, he's writing from a communist. Remember, the Communist Manifesto was written 1848, and so he's looking at this as a radical, revolutionary socialist, and he sees this as the great clash of the classes, the bourgeoisie now in favor of free labor, and this kind of atavistic, slaveholding, feudalistic class of slaveholders taking their last stand against free labor in America. The first grand war of contemporaneous history, he wrote, is the American War, the highest form of popular self-government till now realized is giving battle to the meanest and most shameless form of man's enslaving recorded in the annals of history. One of my favorites was a history professor by the name of Edouard Laboulaye, who taught at the Collège de France in Paris. He was one of the leading authorities on American law and constitution and history. He had, during the regime of Napoleon III, all of the press was censored. You couldn't speak openly in class or in public meetings. He shifted his attention to Roman law just to be safe. One of his colleagues had been fired from the college because he had spoken out against the Second Empire of Napoleon III. But now, with the American crisis, Laboulaye began to speak in his lecture class about the American crisis. And for him and for other Republicans in France, to talk about America was a way of talking about France, but by evading the censors. So you could discuss republicanism and the perils of republicanism in America without violating this very strict code of what you could speak about. His lecture halls filled. There were people out in the hallways. Foreigners came to visit, workers in Paris. And the U.S. consul, John Bigelow, who was a master of the new public diplomacy, also would come to visit Laboulaye's class. He wrote in 1864, "The world is a solidarity, and the cause of America is the cause of liberty. So long as there shall be across the Atlantic a society of 30 millions of men living happily and peacefully under a government of their choice, with laws made by themselves, liberty will cast her rays over Europe like an illuminating pharos. But should liberty become eclipsed in the New World, it would become night in Europe." So this is our war too, Laboulaye is saying. And that image of liberty casting its light across the Atlantic is very important. Laboulaye, a year later, would meet with a group of Republicans in his country home outside of Paris. This was in the summer after the Lincoln assassination, and there was talk about some kind of monument for Lincoln, for America, for Franco-American friendship. Among the dinner group was a young artist by the name of Auguste Bartholdi, the Alsatian artist and sculptor who 20 years later, but with the idea born in that conversation after dinner in 1865, would erect the Statue of Liberty, liberty enlightening the world, with the 7 rays on her crown illuminating the 7 continents of the world. Others began to see this as a battle in which they all had a stake. Ramon Castilla, the Republican president of Peru, predicted that Latin America was about to witness a war of the crowns against the liberty caps. We all had a stake in this, Castilla was saying, that what happens in Mexico, in the United States, was going to affect us, that the whole issue of whether or not we were going to have republics that we govern ourselves or monarchies and perhaps be ruled by Europe again was at stake. Now, Lincoln, a most unworldly man who had never been outside the United States and didn't read a lot of foreign literature outside of Shakespeare, he nonetheless became very interested in this idea of the Republican experiment, and almost from the beginning began to interpret the war as a test of democracy. And this resonated very much abroad. Nowhere is this idea of democracy on trial better expressed than in his November 1863 address before the crowd at Gettysburg, the new National Cemetery. And listen to it as an expression to the world about what this war meant for all of them. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, the United States, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. So it's a universalizing language. And the new birth of freedom, which most historians interpret just as a reference to the Emancipation Proclamation, I think had a much broader meaning for those who heard those words abroad. And that famous phrase that he ends with, of the people, by the people, for the people, this goes deeply into America, into European literature, and most famously and most widely known with Giuseppe Mazzini, who summoned the people of Italy to join Young Italy in 1833, I believe, with very similar words about a republic of the people, by the people, for the people. So what I'm suggesting here is that both sides were experimenting with what we would now call soft power and public diplomacy. Soft power is an expression we'll probably hear in the upcoming presidential debate. I hope we'll get to something like public diplomacy and soft power. It would be very elevating for all of us, wouldn't it? but it's a word that was introduced in diplomatic circles, and Joseph Nye wrote a book on soft power. And as I was beginning to work on this subject, it was actually my agent, David Miller, said, it sounds like what you're dealing with is what we call soft power. And it was a brilliant connection that stayed in my mind. But soft power means that you appeal to the people rather than just debate with the governments in the marbled halls of power, government to government. You make appeals either directly or surreptitiously to the people. And it's not propaganda where you just get a big megaphone and say, this is what we are fighting for. But instead, soft power attempts to persuade that your cause is our cause. We are defending republicanism, something that you in Europe and Latin America have fought and died for, and that whether you have achieved it or not, this is what we're fighting for. Join us, support us. And the idea here is not to try to overturn or change British or French or Spanish foreign policy. These are the main powers threatening America at the time. But to exact a political cost on the governments if they offended, if they went against public opinion that was in favor of this Republican cause, or so the theory went. Now, the American Civil War takes place in a period of robust communications and a very robust popular press, penny newspapers that could be published on with new technologies, steam presses, and distributed for very little money. We had a network of telegraphs that flashed the news across continents in minutes, as fast as the news could be tapped out with Morse code. And then, though the transatlantic cable had been installed and then it broke just before the war, before it could really be put into use, the war would have been changed radically had it not broken. Nonetheless, we had very fast steamships that could get across the Atlantic in 10 or 11 days, depending on the weather. And as soon as they arrived in Ireland, the telegraph would take the news across the continent, way into the Middle East, into Northern Africa, into India, wherever the sinews of commerce followed. And so one could talk about, usually when they talked about the public or the public mind, they meant getting at the public mind through the press. The press was never believed to reflect the public mind, but it could mold the public sentiment. And so it was that a lot of these battles, the battles of what I call the battle of ink and ideas, took place through efforts to control the press or to get your message out through the press. And the American Civil War also witnessed pioneering episodes in what would later be known as public diplomacy. Again, they didn't use these terms. It was regarded as something that you didn't want to do kind of above board. It's not espionage and it's not propaganda, they would say, but they paid secretly agents to go abroad and to get their message before the people. And sometimes this meant paying, giving inducements, as they said, to publishers, to editors, and to authors. And other times it meant buying their own newspaper or setting up their own journal or publishing their own press. So public diplomacy is born in the Civil War. And by that I mean these are the first government-sponsored, deliberate programs that are funded, staffed, and aimed at assuaging or influencing public opinion abroad with the effort of discouraging discouraging foreign governments from violating the Union or the Confederacy's will. William Henry Seward, I think, was really took the lead in this for the Union. Seward understood. He was a rough and tumble New York politician who had climbed his way up. He was presidential hopeful. He was sadly disappointed when Lincoln, this unknown prairie lawyer, won the presidency in 1860. But he was a faithful and very energetic servant of the Lincoln administration as Secretary of State. He understood diplomacy as an extension of democratic politics. Go to the people, arouse the people in your favor. He deeply distrusted European governments. They were aristocratic monarchs. They hated Republican and Democratic governments. They wanted the first for America, and we should never trust them. But go to the people. Early in the war, an unusual opportunity, public diplomacy opportunity came up when rumors were circulating that the great Italian hero, Giuseppe Garibaldi, wanted to return to America. He had been there in exile on Staten Island in 1850-51, wanted to return to America and raise his sword for the cause of liberty and the Union. Seward sent his most trusted ambassador, Henry Sanford from Connecticut, over to this little island called Caprera out in the middle of the Mediterranean off of the island of Sardinia. Is windswept, hot, rocky island where Garibaldi lived in a kind of quasi-exile at this time. Sanford's coming across, he takes a steamship, secretly comes across a rowboat, then walks a mile, hot sun, and arrives at this very rustic house where Garibaldi lived. And he is there to offer Garibaldi leadership, a command in the Union Army. Garibaldi has two conditions. One, he wants total command of all armed forces in the Union. I would be of no use as second in command, as a lieutenant. A pilot must be in charge of his ship, he said. But he also wanted the authority to declare the war against slavery. He said, if this is not to emancipate the Negroes, if this is just another civil war over territory and borders and sovereignty, it will have no interest to the world. It must have some kind of moral cause. What is it you're fighting for? Sanford at that time had no authority to say anything about slavery except that this was not the Union's purpose. The Union's purpose was to restore its sovereignty and to put down this insurrection. End of conversation. Garibaldi remained a friend of the Union and wished it well, but he did not come to America. He was involved in his own politics, but that's the first chapter of the book, and a fascinating story. He makes an encore appearance that I'll talk about later, maybe if we have time in the questions. Later in that same fall, Seward sent over a team of speakers on a speakers tour. And this was one of these where, you know, he was paying with State Department money, but it was billed as a private initiative. And he sent two clergymen. One was Archbishop John Hughes, a Catholic archbishop, Irish-born hero of the Irish in New York and throughout America. And another was Charles McIlvaine, an Episcopalian, or in England, Anglican clergyman, who was also, he had been involved in Washington and was the chaplain to the Senate, and he was politically savvy. And along with them went Thurlow Weed, who was Seward's mentor, a seasoned veteran newspaper man and political infighter in New York who knew how to use the press, was very wise, one of the kind of the wise men. And also along with them was old Fuss and Feathers Winfield Scott, the recently retired head of the Army. And so they went over on this ship, on this adventure in public diplomacy, and they arrived just as the Trent crisis erupted, and where it looked like Europe was on the verge of war. And this is one of the stories I tell in the book about how Weed and Bigelow, the consul in Paris, who was given unofficial responsibility for managing the press, and as Seward put it, putting the public mind in the right direction, they engineered this by having Winfield Scott write a letter, a public letter that declared that surely this was a mistake, that this apprehension of the two envoys on board the Trent was the Union captain's doing, and that this was not meant to provoke war with the British and so on. Weed goes out to meet with the foreign secretary in outside of London, and that conversation between these two men, one of the most dramatic, I think, in the story that I tell about that. So part of public diplomacy then, in Seward's view, was to kind of get a megaphone and have these speakers go out. All of them played a very important role, by the way, in telling Europeans what this was about. And initially, Seward has this religious idea of reaching people from the pulpit through Hughes and through McIlvaine, and encouraging fellow Christians across the Atlantic that to stay out of this war, that to let America take care of this insurrection on its own and not let Britain or France interfere. Hughes also played a very important role in Ireland on his way back, and he also visited the Vatican, who would the Pope Pius IX would come into play here. Another part of my story that I can't tell now, but was a very exciting episode in the in this game, this battle of public diplomacy. The Union also listened to foreigners. I quoted from Karl Marx, Edward Laboulaye. His works were translated. A young woman in New York. There aren't many women in my story, but boy, the ones who do show up really played an important role. Mary Louise Booth, later the editor of Harper's Bazaar. You've heard of that. She translated these works by Laboulaye, Agénor Gasparine, and other French authors to try to show Americans, here's what the Europeans are expecting of this. They see this as a battle for an international struggle to preserve democracy and liberty, broadly conceived, not just free labor. And I tell the story also of a number of others, of John Bright, the radical English suffrage advocate, of Ottilie Ossing, a fascinating woman from Berlin who came over. She became Frederick Douglass's lover and collaborator, and those two worked out a lot of their ideas together. William Howard Russell, one of the first modern war correspondents, a famous correspondent for the London Times, who went to the Crimean War and wrote the account of the charge of the Light Brigade, which Alfred Lord Tennyson read and in a night put into that famous poem about the British charging into this lethal suicidal charge in the Crimea. Now, the South also got engaged in public diplomacy, and partly because they saw Seward moving these people over and sending speakers over, and Thurlow Weed diffusing the Trent crisis, and both sides are writing back to the Home Office and saying the other side has the advantage. They have the press in their pocket. Send more money, send more people. We can win this case. The Southern public diplomacy mission, though, generally distrusted native authors, as they called them, because they felt that in Britain, but also in France, that they were prone to be subject to what in Europe was what they called the philanthropic sentimentality towards slavery. Britain was very proud of its anti-slavery tradition and saw itself as the world leader in abolitionism. And the French, while they weren't quite as moralistic about it, were pretty clearly throughout all sides of the political spectrum were anti-slavery. The South wanted to control the message. They sent over some very able public diplomatists. One was Henry Hotz, a Civil War figure you may not have heard of, but he was really fascinating. A young man, he was in his mid-20s. He had come from Switzerland, and as a young man come to Mobile, Alabama. And there he got involved with the press, was a writer. He went abroad with the U.S. Embassy in Belgium, so he had diplomatic experience. He collaborated in Mobile with Hosea Nott, a scientist who was very interested in racial explanations, racial scientific explanations for slavery, and had a theory of polygenesis, that black people were a separate creation before Adam and Eve. And he also, Hotz, became very interested in Arthur Gobineau, whose essay on human inequality was a pioneering example of scientific racism, as it would later be called. Adolf Hitler was a great admirer of Gobineau, and Hotze tried to enlist him in the Confederate cause. Hotze also took a great interest in the London Anthropological Society that was also beginning to develop the first ideas of scientific racism, meaning that they were looking for, instead of biblical explanations about what made people different, scientific explanations. Hotze realized very quickly that no matter how much money the Confederacy had, that they couldn't just trust British or French newspapers to tell their side of the story. And he asked for money to set up his own, and it was called the Index, and it became the unofficial mouthpiece for the Confederate government in London and therefore throughout much of Europe. The other is a very colorful character by the name of Edwin de Leon. He was sent with primary responsibility to France. De Leon was a character. He had grown up in Columbia, South Carolina. The son and or grandson of Sephardic Jews who had come from the Iberian Peninsula, hence the name de Leon, and through Europe over to South Carolina. South Carolina, by the way, had a long and very proud tradition of tolerance for Jews, and it had one of the largest Jewish populations in colonial America and continued in the 19th century. He went to the University of South Carolina, the later College of at that time, the College of Carolina. At first was very involved in the Young America movement, which was a kind of literary nationalist movement modeled after Giuseppe Mazzini's Young Italy, and then channeled his nationalistic fervor into secessionist movements and published a secessionist newspaper in Washington, D.C. in the 1850s. Some think it was to get him out of town that President Pierce gave him an appointment as consul to Alexandria, Egypt. And it was in Alexandria that he learned of the secession of his native state, South Carolina. He decided to resign his position, and he rushed to Paris to help win recognition for the Confederacy. He brought diplomatic experience, extraordinary skill as a writer, and a persuasive, polemical writer. All of his hopes were based on the Trent crisis and the hope that Britain and the United States would go into war and the Confederacy would win recognition as an enemy of the British enemy. And that and when that fell apart, he was deeply disappointed. He was friends with Jefferson Davis and would write on his own authority long letters to Davis telling him about what was going on in Europe, usually with details about how his other envoys in France and Britain were failing him, and that they were all a bunch of old men and didn't know what they were doing. They came back to Richmond and brought to Jefferson Davis this absolutely beautiful Arabian stallion that he had gotten in the Middle East, and presented it to him as a gift. And then talked to Davis. By de Leon's account, he elaborated on this idea that the Confederacy was this young, robust infant nation, but it was being led by these doddering old men, present company accepted, I'm sure he said to Davis, but that all of these people didn't know what they were doing, didn't know about European diplomacy, and that what they needed was some young blood, but also they needed money for someone to be an ambassador to public opinion, to get the message out. And don't just talk to the governments, but to arouse public support for their side. And he was the man. He came away from that meeting with Jefferson Davis with a purse of $25,000, a tremendous amount of money at that time, that he could spend any way he wanted to. He came back to France. He used his money liberally to induce publishers, particularly in provincial France, to sympathize with the Confederate cause. And then he also published his own pamphlet. He wanted to, it was anonymous, but everyone knew who it was. He published it in French, and according to some, not very good French, a little bit too American, a little too Creole, some said, a little too rustic for the French ear. Um, but his pamphlet, The Truth About the Confederate States of America, sought to educate the French in several respects. One, to tell them that slavery as practiced in the American South was very different from what they had known in Saint-Domingue, or later known as Haiti. This was not like a sugar colony with all male workers that were being worked to death. This was, in America, a domestic institution, a Christianizing institution, benign. The slaves were loyal, they were happy, they were not abandoning their masters during the war. Their only anxiety was that these Yankees were going to come in, these hypocritical Yankees, and take them away from their masters. He also made the novel argument that the Southerners were Latin, that they were Latin in origin and in their affinities. They were fighting the same war that the French had fought against the British. They were fighting this war against these zealous Puritans in the North that were desecrating Catholic churches in Louisiana, and that were espousing these ideas of radical egalitarianism. The South was populated by Anglo-Normans and the Huguenots in South Carolina and the French Creoles in Louisiana. We're one of you. We joined you, the French, in this commitment to stave off the Anglo-Saxon influence of the North. By this time, Confederate strategy was shifting toward the French because with their enterprise in Mexico, they needed the Confederacy as a buffer state between that Anglo-Saxon democracy of the United States and this Latin empire of Maximilians in Mexico. So what you're seeing here is a kind of unplanned exercise, which by the second and third year of the war, the South is gravitating to the right. That is, it is embracing this Mexican expedition of the French. It is defending slavery. Early in the war, they were instructed, the envoys were instructed, don't talk about slavery. Just make this a case for self-determination, for self-government. But now they're defending slavery. They're introducing racial theories to defend slavery. And they're also sending envoys to the Vatican and to try to enlist Pope Pius IX, the author of the Syllabus of Errors, the inventor of the infallible Pope, on the side of the Confederacy. The Union, in the meantime, was also shifting toward the left, that is, embracing emancipation, answering Garibaldi's question by saying, now this is a war against slavery, and by appealing to those Europeans and Latin Americans that this is a war for emancipation, broadly conceived, not just for slaves, but emancipation of labor generally, and a defense of government by the people against the aristocratic forces of the South that were now making alliance with the aristocrats of Europe. The Union also was able to encase the slavery issue, which some Europeans felt strongly about, many didn't, and they encased it within a broader ideological debate about the future of government by the people. Aristocratic privilege and slavery were both rooted. They were two sides of the same coin, based on the idea of inherited inequality. Aristocrats were born with privilege, and slaves were born with subjugation, inherited inferiority in social terms. And that these principles were inherently opposed to democratic ideals of equality of rights, natural rights, and popular sovereignty. Now, these ideas, these battles of ink and ideas that I described, no one really knew whether or not they were working, whether they were taking. I mean, they were echoed in the press, and and the press was repeating them, but you didn't really know how the public was taking them down. In Britain, it was pretty clear. After the Emancipation Proclamation, especially, public meetings were held all over Britain. And even when the press tried to ignore them, they published their own accounts of these meetings and really made it known that Britain, that working class people as well as middle class people, that they were behind the Union now that it was on the side of emancipation. In France, public meetings were forbidden, and there was no really way to tell. It was clear that the Mexican adventure was becoming unpopular, and it was clear from at least the liberal and Republican members of the Chamber of Deputies that they opposed Napoleon III's flirtation with the Confederacy, but they didn't really know what the public felt. And then at the end of the war, the news of the Union victory came just days before the news of Lincoln's assassination. And there was a kind of burst of public expression and emotion in the streets of Paris, in villages all over Europe. It was striking. In one instance, and I begin in the introduction with this story, French students in the Latin Quarter go to Laboulaye's lecture. It's supposed to be on Benjamin Franklin, but this is April 28th, or 2 days later, April 30th, I guess, after the news has arrived. And everyone expects and everyone is treated to this very emotional eulogy that Laboulaye, from his sick bed, rises to give for Abraham Lincoln. And the students pour out of the lecture hall, and by plans that had been prearranged, they gather at Pont Saint-Michel, and they are going to march out to John Bigelow's house out by the Arc de Triomphe, down the Champs-Élysées, in solidarity with Lincoln and with America and the Union and the Great Republic. The police come out. Again, public demonstrations like this are not permitted. They draw their swords, they break up the students, they arrest several, knock others on the head, but others are able to escape. They come through the back streets of Paris, out to Bigelow's house, 3 miles away. They arrive sweaty and dirty and tired, and there's a police cordon outside Bigelow's house, and they break through it, just emboldened by their own defiance, come into the house. One of them pulls out a sheet of paper and gives this statement in favor of the United States, the Union's victory, their sympathy for Mrs. Lincoln, and they finish with these rousing shouts of "Vive la Grande Republique, vive Lincoln." And Bigelow, later that night, after others come to the house to demonstrate their support of America, he writes to William Seward, "I had no idea that Mr. Lincoln had such a hold upon the heart of the young gentlemen of France. No one had any idea until that night, until that moment, when people in France anyway could express themselves freely. And it was just the beginning. In the next few weeks, people met in churches, in meeting halls, in the streets, in workers' union halls, and in taverns. And they issued letters of condolence, some individually, but often in groups with long lists of signatures. Bigelow gathered them and sent them back to Washington, translated them first, sent them back to Washington, and suggested that they be published. Later, 1,000 letters from all over the world, mostly Europe, heavily from Britain, but also from Latin America, wherever the news reached them, sometimes taking weeks and months before it arrived. People expressed themselves with these letters and resolutions. All of them were translated, published, as first as part of the appendix to the annual correspondence of diplomatic correspondence, and then sent copies to all of the governments of the world. This is public diplomacy, showing them, here's what your people think about Lincoln, America, our war that you didn't support, and about Republican ideals. And so it was a brilliant exercise in public diplomacy. It may have embarrassed some of the signers of those letters, I might add. This was a moment in the summer of 1865, and for the next 2 or 3 years, in which Republicans, embattled and beleaguered and defeated in Europe and really on the ropes in Latin America, were encouraged, emboldened, and reinvigorated. I call it the Republican Risorgimento that takes place in the next few years. Spain, first of all, very wisely withdrew from Santo Domingo in the summer of 1865 after 4 years of bloody guerrilla warfare in the jungles of Santo Domingo. It's restored as a republic. They also withdraw from Peru and Chile, where they had provoked wars, apparently in an effort to take back lost empires. And then in 1868, Spain faces a Republican revolution in Cuba. Cuba, remember, never became independent. Wouldn't become independent until 1898, and even then was subject to governance by the United States. And at the same time as this revolution, this Republican revolution for independence rises in Cuba, back in Madrid, the Glorious Revolution, as it's called, overthrows Queen Isabella II. She flees to France. And Spain, for the first time, stands before the world with a representative government. It's a short-lived Republican experiment, but it was another sign of this contagion of liberty and revolution that emanated from the Union's victory. Napoleon III also decided after the Union victory that it was time to end what he called the civilizing mission in Mexico. Encouraging him were General U.S. Grant sent Phil Sheridan down with about 40,000 Union veterans on the border with Mexico. They would often pile guns and ammunition on the shores of the Rio Grande at night, and the next morning they disappeared. Benito Juarez and his men were using them. Hundreds, we don't know how many, but hundreds of Union veterans also were coming across the border to join with Benito Juarez in this war against the remaining French troops and against the empire of Maximilian. The French finally withdrew altogether, and Maximilian was left to face a firing squad in June of 1867, a Mexican Republican firing squad. The shots that fired that day echoed across the Atlantic as a warning to all of the European powers that the days of European intervention and recolonization and recovering lost empires was over. 3 years later, Napoleon III himself was deposed. This was, of course, during his disastrous war with the Prussians, where he was captured on the field of battle, fled to exile in England, and Paris went up in flames with the Paris Commune, and the Third Republic was declared in 1871. Britain also, though it managed once again to avoid revolutionary upheaval, really went through some important changes in the wake of the American Civil War. In British North America, otherwise known as Canada, they organized what we know as Canada for the first time. It began during the war, but they set up a confederation that essentially established Canada as a self-governing autonomous unit, still part of the empire, but nonetheless with its own government. And back home in Britain, British radicals, as they were known, John Bright's band of suffrage reformers, led tremendous demonstrations in all of the major cities of London calling for universal suffrage, including women's suffrage, which was defeated but or was not enacted, but it was nonetheless imagined. And in outright defiance of Parliament's rules against public demonstrations, or riots as they called them, they barged into Hyde Park and amassed by the tens of thousands. And finally, Parliament caved in and enacted the Reform Act of 1867, bringing Britain to the leadership of democratization in Europe. But also this whole ring of empire and slavery that had surrounded the United States began to disappear. Russia sells Alaska and it cedes its claims, not just there, but also coming all the way down the coast of California. And the end of slavery in the United States signaled the death knell for slavery in its remaining bastions in the Caribbean and Brazil. Cuba in the midst of this revolution. The Republicans had promised freedom to those slaves who joined them in arms against the Spanish. Now the Spanish, which was in control of the Republicans, tell the slaves that their children of slave mothers will be free. It's what is called the Free Womb Law, and it's the beginning of the end for slavery in Cuba. Brazil, in 1871, passed its own free womb law, promising freedom to the children of slaves. One senator in Rio de Janeiro announced, "We didn't need a war to end slavery. The world laughing at us was enough. The scorn of all nations was enough." They were the last. That would eventually be abolished altogether in 1886 and 1888, Cuba and Brazil, but it was on the road to extinction in these years immediately following America's Civil War. Horrible new challenges lay ahead for democracy in the 20th century, but for a moment in the 1860s, it seemed that against all expectations, a democratic society had proven that it could defend itself and that it could field an amazingly vast army, a citizens' army of 2 million men in the United States, and sustain itself during 4 grueling years of internecine warfare and even an assassination. They even held elections during this war. Democracy had survived, and slavery had been all but destroyed throughout the Americas. Eugene Pelletan, one of the French Republicans, put it this way in the summer of 1865. America is not only America, one place or one race more on the map. It is yet and especially the model school of liberty. If against all possibility it had perished, with it would fall a great experiment. English radical Edward Beasley put it in his own words, "Under a strain such as no aristocracy, no monarchy, no empire could have supported, Republican institutions have stood firm. It is we now who call upon the privileged classes to mark the result."
Don, I'm amazed at what I don't know.
You know it now.
That was just wonderful. Thank you so much. I have to ask this first question because I really did not know all of this that you told us today. And it made me wonder, if the South had won, how would Europe have tried to deconstruct the Republic? Did they really want the Republic to fail?
The United States Republic.
Yes.
Yeah, there was talk of the South being just the first of this, what they refer to as dismemberment, that the Middle West would also, because it was dependent upon the Mississippi River, that would now be controlled by a foreign power, that they would also break off from the Northeast. And of course, the far West, what had been the Mexican cession, Napoleon said that once Maximilian comes in there, that the Mexican Empire might reclaim that. And more threatening still, he said that his uncle had sold Louisiana to the United States of America, and that if Louisiana had now seceded, that it was back to France. Now, this was, kind of fanciful, but it was a threat. And during the war, the French did make overtures to Texas, and it was the Confederates, while they were trying to make alliance with the French, were also very worried that the French were going to be a worse enemy than the United States. But yes, I think it would have destabilized all of North America.
Wow. Which side do you think, Union or Confederate, had the most effective PR machine operating in Europe? What did they do that was particularly effective?
I tried to outline that. I think the both of them had effective and well-funded programs, and I would say that the Confederacy actually had put more money into it. It had people like De Leon and Hotz who were exclusively devoted to persuading the public mind. But I think their problem was that they could not and did not trust native authors, and it was more effective. The Union was more effective in letting Laboulaye and Gasparin and others speak for them, and make it their cause in their native idiom, so to speak, and literally, and that. So I think that Seward and Lincoln had a better grasp of what we would call soft power in public diplomacy. It was more effective, but also because it was more their cause in the end, as they defined it, was more in line with liberal public sentiment in Europe.
Don, do you have any idea how many Europeans came across the pond to fight, and on which side did they fight?
Yeah, I have a whole chapter there called Foreign Legions, and one of the things that I came out with, first of all, there was an embarrassment on the Union side during the war. The Southerners and Southern sympathizers in Europe were saying, you're fighting with a bunch of mercenaries, soldiers of fortune, and the South is defending itself with its own native sons. And Slidell played on this. You know, we're spilling our own blood, sacrificing our own sons, and the Union's using this cannon fodder. So they were embarrassed about it. They tried to play it down and deny that there were as many foreigners as they were. And then they've been ignored, partly because a lot of them were Germans. Their letters and diaries did not get translated, and they were ignored. But I make the point that 43%, I estimate, it can't be exact, because no one cared where you came from. If you wanted to fight, here's a gun, uniform. You don't have to tell us where you came from. You don't have to be a citizen. But 43% of the Union armed forces, Navy and Army, were immigrants and the sons of immigrants. About a quarter of the Union Army was born in foreign countries. Foremost were the Germans and then the Irish. But you have them. I have one passage on Garibaldi's Guard from New York, the 39th. They had, of course, some Italians, but it was mainly they had Swiss, they had French, they had Catholics, Protestants, and Jews. They had 3 chaplains, people serving these different religious groups, and they had to do the Pledge of Allegiance in something like 14 different languages. I mean, this was a cosmopolitan group. They have a group of reenactors, by the way, up in New York, in very colorful uniforms. But this was, I went through a lot of these German letters. They were translated for me, by the way. Wonderful collection of German-American letters. And not all of them, but many of them were very ideological, and they were fighting over here, fighting the war that their parents had fought or they had fought back in 1848 and lost, and now they were carrying on in this new war for republicanism, for liberty, against the aristocracy, you name it. I mean, they had different versions of it, and it didn't have to be exactly true to be effective.
Don, can you clarify for us the use of the words republic and democracy?
Okay, yeah, they were used in rather loose ways at the time. Of course, what we mean by republic is a government in which the government is representing the people. It has been elected by the people. How many elected the government is not clear, but it's usually a republic means without monarchy and without inherited power. So popular sovereignty. Often the term they would use is popular government. And democracy was a term that usually it meant at this time, universal suffrage. Now, I always correct this, and if I don't, my wife does, universal manhood suffrage, because they would use the term universal suffrage to mean, of course, all adult men. Extreme democracy. And these were terms that were used even by liberal sympathizers in Europe as kind of, radical ideas that you give everyone the vote, look at what you get. Here's people fighting, killing each other in America. So those terms were used loosely, but there is a distinction between republic and democracy. Democracy being more inclusive, more radical in its inclusion of the voting power.
Don, you mentioned that the underwater cable broke, which I did not know that.
Yeah.
So if it didn't break, what effect or what outcome would have been changed?
Yes, I thought about that. You know, historians usually poo-poo any kind of counterfactual history, but you can't help but think how things would have changed. And one instance, I think, came in the Trent crisis when Britain was just ready to go to war. They got news 2 weeks later about the capture of these two Confederate envoys. American Union Navy officers had boarded a British ship and had taken off these passengers. It's a violation of neutrality. Thurlow Weed reminded them, you know, this is what we fought in 1812 when you were impressing our sailors. And I think that, but what they learned was also that Americans were celebrating and treating this Union captain as a hero for having taken these Confederate envoys off the ship, and were bragging about how they had given John Bull a bloody nose here, and it really was an emotional thing. They issued demands, and Prince Albert, from his deathbed, rose and softened the demands, and allowed Lincoln and Seward a faith-saving way of escaping. Now, the story I tell is that Thurlow Weed had helped set this up before in his wonderful conversation that he has before breakfast or before lunch in his country estate, on which more later if you want. But that was an instance where if the news had come back more quickly from Britain and from America, I think it might have gotten out of hand more quickly. And so tempers were allowed to cool a little bit in this. Remember, it's 11 days over, decision, 11 days back, and it allowed time to cool. On Christmas Day, Lincoln met with his cabinet and decided to release the prisoners, and that he said, one war at a time.
Ah, interesting. How much official recognition of Confederacy occurred from European and Latin nations?
Yeah. Okay. So the Confederacy did not win international recognition. It remained an unrecognized state. But it's a little more complicated than this. By the way, recognition, I mean, that's what all of this is about. Most separatist movements, they don't really win on the field of battle. We always look at the Civil War as a military conflict, but it's a diplomatic contest. And what the South was trying to do, in addition, it's a diplomatic contest. What the South was trying to do is demonstrate that it could defend itself, and more than that, that it might even take over parts of America, including Washington, the capital. Jefferson Davis wanted that for the Confederate capital. But also just to hold out until third parties came in and said, we've got to have cotton, we've got to end this war, and we're going to mediate a peace. And so that's what they were hoping for. Early in the war, in May, England led by recognizing both parties as belligerents. And what this meant was that this is an actual war between two parties. It's the first step toward recognition of the Confederacy as a sovereign nation. 11 countries recognized the Confederacy and the Union as belligerents. They awarded, therefore, belligerent rights. This gets into an area of international law that may seem a little murky, but what it means is it's not just a domestic insurrection. This is a war between two parties, and we are going to treat the Confederacy as a belligerent. But they would not receive diplomats in government. They often met in Britain. They would meet at the private home of Lord Palmerston, the Prime Minister, or Earl Russell, the Foreign Secretary. Jefferson Davis groused. He said, our envoys are being made to wait in the back porches and in hallways like supplicants, and he wanted to withdraw all of the foreign envoys. But that's the way it was. And if you were not recognized, you could not be treated as an official representative of a nation state.
Well, Don, I want to thank you so much for all of your comments today. You've got one more question? Well, you started to talk just now about the importance of cotton. Can you talk about just a little bit more about how important cotton was to the world's economy?
Yeah. This was a basic staple. I mean, it was really the basis for the Industrial Revolution. Sven Beckert did this marvelous book on the empire of cotton that has gotten all kinds of attention this year. And he shows how critical the Civil War was in distributing the cotton production throughout the world, and particularly into India. And it was, a necessity because this main supply in the South had been closed off through the blockade, first through the Southern embargo, then through the Union blockade, and just through the disruption of war. So they had to go elsewhere. And the South recovered, and it resupplied much of the world, but it lost market share because of this war. But in the meantime, the world had a much more balanced supply from different parts of the world. But that crop, that little lighter than air commodity, that is extremely important to the modern world we live in. The clothes we wear, but also all of the commercial development that's centered around cotton.
Well, thank you again for all your comments. Don has left us with several ticklers about that you can find out about in his book. And he has his book over in the Women's Club room where he's going to be following me to sign copies of it. Please join us over in the Women's Club room. Thank you all for coming.
Good. I hope I didn't go on too long. I forgot to take off my watch.